30 videos in 30 days, day 6. Today's question comes from several people. Many of you asked or sent in a question saying, hey, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your awakening story and how you came to your gifts. So I'm going to share that story with you now. I grew up in a really small town in Wyoming, Cody, Wyoming. And while it is a very cultured town and has a lot of very intelligent people, it's not really a spiritual hotspot. And growing up before the internet, before we had, every bit of information we could ever want at our fingertips, I grew up and I was always fascinated by crystals, by tarot, by Ouija boards, by witchcraft, by aliens, by anything that was sort of esoteric or spiritual or out there on the fringe. I also have always had the ability to tune into energy and to read energy. I call myself an energy intuitive because that's what I do. So as a child, I wasn't really paying attention to what was being said or wasn't really paying attention to the experience in the physical sense. I was more interested or more tuned into what was happening energetically. What did someone feel like? What did a space feel like or a place feel like energetically? When someone was talking to me, what was the energy that I felt coming from them as they were speaking? I remember when I was a little kid being fascinated by crystals and rocks, and there was this little store down the street. It was like a gem rock hunter, rock hound store, and he had lots of pocket stones and lots of geological anomalies, and it's what you would expect to walk in and find the little pocket stones. And my friends and I used to go down there and pore over the bins of crystals and rocks, and I was fascinated by them, and I used to collect them and pick up my favorite ones. And I remember much later in my life, one time I had this little tray, and I had laid out all of these crystals just in a little pattern, and I didn't really know what I was doing consciously. I was just laying them out in a pattern. And my friend asked me, she said, "What is that? What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, well, they're energy healing grids." I didn't know what an energy healing grid was. I had no way of knowing that. I had never read about it. I had never heard about it. It was just something that came from within. So I've always had these abilities. Funny story as an aside, I was obsessed with Stephen King when I was a kid. So anything paranormal or supernatural, man, that was totally my jam. And I loved Firestarter. That was one of my favorite movies as a kid and one of my favorite books of his. And I wanted to have telekinesis more than anything. And I used to sit in my bedroom and I would put like a sock or a baseball or an object or something in the middle of my floor, and I would sit there for hours staring at it, trying to will it to move. Needless to say, it didn't work ever, and I still haven't remembered how to be telekinetic, but I digress. Anyway, growing up with these abilities, I just assumed that that's how everyone was. I just assumed that that's how everyone, it didn't seem out of the ordinary for me. I just thought, well, this is how everyone navigates the world. Growing up and becoming older, it became very clear to me that no, this was not the case. And around the age of, I would say 10 or 11, when I really began to realize that I was gay, and that made me different, and I was always different growing up, and then realizing that no, the way that I interpreted people's energy and sort of read energy was also not what everyone else did, I really began to suppress my gifts, because to me it felt like one more thing that made me different, one more thing that made me stand out from the crowd. And all I wanted more than anything at that point in my life was to belong and to be included and to be part of the cool kids. So I spent a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to suppress this and trying to hide from it. Fast forward to the mid-90s, probably 94 and 95. I was living in Seattle at the time. I was a makeup artist, and I was hanging out with a friend, and we were talking about Deepak Chopra, and Deepak Chopra was sort of my first foray and for my first he was my gateway drug into the spiritual realm, consciously and deliberately beginning to explore my spirituality. And I decided to meditate. So I went home and I didn't really know how to meditate. I had never meditated before. And so I sat down in the lotus pose and I put my fingers on my knees and I closed my eyes and I started breathing. And as I started breathing, I started making sounds, because I had remembered hearing about those monks that do the throat singing, and I thought, well, maybe that's part of it. So I started making the sounds with my throat, not unlike, really interestingly enough, I made the connection years later, or a couple of years ago. It was very similar to the sound healing that I do. So that's an interesting connection, an interesting correlation. Anyway, I was meditating and I was doing the sounds, and all of a sudden I started to feel this energy building within me, and something happened, and for a moment I had a complete and total transcendent experience where I became one with everything. No longer was I Andrew. The identity of Andrew was gone, and I became one with the universe and with the stars and with the planets and with the flowers and the trees, and I felt the limitlessness of myself, and I felt the infinity of the universe and of all things, and I felt myself connected to all of it. It was probably about a second that I had this experience, but it felt like it went on forever. And then, of course, my mind came in and was like, whoa, what is this? This is weird. This is not normal. What is this? And shut it down. And over the years, I tried to, well, I didn't try to, but I sort of explained that experience away and was just like, oh, it was a one-time thing, or oh, I don't know, maybe I was hungover or whatever. I think I came up with a lot of clever ways to convince myself that it was not as sort of an out-of-body or transcendent experience as it was. So then fast forward to about 10 years later, I was living in New York at the time, and I had been in New York as a makeup artist for about 7 years. And I was at the end of my rope. I was miserable, I was unhappy, I was drinking like crazy, I was doing a lot of drugs, I was like $30,000 or more in debt, I was having a lot of sex, I was doing everything I could do to soothe myself and numb myself, and my life was falling apart. I had lost my apartment in the city, and I was living with some friends in Jersey City across the river. And what had started as me just wanting to sleep on their living room floor for a couple of weeks to figure things out turned into 8 months, 9 months later, here I am still in their living room. So they said basically, Andrew, honey, we love you, but you don't live here. You're not a tenant or a roommate, and you need to figure out what you're gonna do. I was terrified. I was panicked. I had no clue what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be in New York anymore. I didn't want to be a makeup artist anymore, but I had no idea what to do because it was what I had been doing for the past 10, 15 years, and I didn't know what else I was gonna do. So I sat down in the living room and I was having my morning coffee, and I was so overwhelmed and I was out of my head with fear and panic, totally unsure of what I was gonna do. And I just said out loud, I need help. I don't know what to do. I'm lost and I'm at the end of my rope. I need help. And then I heard a voice. And this voice said, you do realize that it doesn't have to be this difficult. You can go back to Seattle if you want to. And this was not a voice where you just hear someone you just hear something in your head. This was a voice in the room. I heard a voice, and it freaked me out, man. I was like, are my roommates home? Did someone leave the TV on? Are the neighbors doing something? I looked outside. Did someone say something on the sidewalk? Nobody. It was a moment of total fear and total clarity. My mind was freaking out trying to make sense of this experience that just happened, but in my heart and in my gut, I knew that it was the truth. So 3 weeks later, I had sold everything I had owned except for about 8 boxes of stuff, and I was back in Seattle. Fast forward to 2012. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I had been transferred down there for work. I was working for a modeling agency at the time as an agent, and I was again in the exact same place that I had been when I was in New York. And in between that time, between New York and LA, I had started down the spiritual path, and I had started to explore my gifts again and sort of reopen them, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to make the commitment, and so I ran. So I ran back to being a makeup artist, and I ran back to the fashion industry and ended up working for this modeling agency. So here I am in Los Angeles, same thing, miserable, hating my life, fighting with my boss, not satisfied or happy at all, smoking way too much weed, having way too much sex, again, trying to do everything I could do to just numb myself. So what did I do when I was miserable and unhappy? I decided to paint my apartment because, hey, what else do you do? So I was painting my bathroom, and I was going to the final wall, getting ready to make that first stroke of this beautiful, beautiful turquoise blue. I was just about ready to paint the final wall, and then as the second that my brush touched the wall, I heard the same voice, and it said, you do realize as soon as you finish painting this bathroom that it's going to be time to leave, don't you? And that was it. That was the moment that I completely surrendered. I was floored. The breath was sucked out of my lungs. The air was sucked out of the room. My knees almost buckled, and I went into the living room and I sat down on the couch and I just burst into tears. As I'm looking at this video, I'm realizing that I am well over my 7-minute limit. So you're gonna have to come back tomorrow to hear part 2.